We're going to take a healing journey today. Let us get, excuse me, let us make sure that the stream is reaching both YouTube and Facebook. Very good. There's YouTube. And Facebook. Yes. Who's in the house? Where are you tuning in from? Edberg in the house from Galloway, New Jersey. James Roth says shalom. Who else is with us? Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. It's great to see you guys. Shalom Rav Sal from Neil in Virginia. Great to see you, Neil. Thanks for writing to me. And some of what we talked about on our exchange will come up today. Okay. Ed Berg says, coming in loud and clear. Glad to hear that. Marianne Baddeley, hello from Shropshire, United Kingdom. Bryna Bloomfield says hi from Sharon, Massachusetts, as always. All right. Let us light up the darkness. All right. We are holding on page Kuf Yud. That's page 110 of Tractate Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 14, and we are continuing our discussion of the third Mishnah. The basic principle that we're talking about here is that we don't medicate on Shabbos. We've been talking about this the last 2 days, so we won't go over all the basic rules. But the most basic is that to save a life, of course we medicate on Shabbos. We desecrate Shabbos. We do whatever we need to do to save a life. For a minor ailment, we don't take medicine. We don't apply medicine, neither by ingesting it, nor as an ointment, nor other kinds of treatment. And it's an interesting question. The original reason that we don't medicate on Shabbos is because so many of the medicines in the ancient world were created by grinding with a mortar and pestle. Whether it was something that you were going to eat or an ointment that you were going to put on your skin, the sages were very, didn't want us to make the biblical transgression of grinding in order to prepare the medicine. And so they put a fence around that prohibition and said we don't medicate on Shabbos. Obviously, to save a life, we do. The in-between case is interesting. If you have a migraine headache, that's something that's actually had a specific ruling. For a migraine headache, which is so painful and incapacitating, and I get migraines, and when it's a really bad one, I have to lie down. I can't do anything. So to treat that kind of an ailment, that kind of a headache, it's not life-threatening, but it really makes it impossible to enjoy Shabbos, and you are allowed to medicate in that situation. So that's where we start. But because the fence around the prohibition is we don't medicate on Shabbos, so that begins to be applied to all kinds of things, where there was never even a chance of grinding. And so yesterday we were talking about, may we immerse in the water of the ocean, right? And we're not talking about, there's other reasons why swimming is prohibited in most communities under most circumstances on Shabbos, and that has to do with splashing. A pool might be okay, a public pool might not. Has to do with throwing water or the fact that you might come to wring out your bathing suit, etc. But from the perspective of medicating on Shabbos, it's permitted to get into water on a hot day and cool off. You're just doing that for pleasure. If you go into the ocean, though, and in the salt water, I suffer from eczema, which actually is quite, it's helped quite a bit when I take a dip in ocean water. So if I felt like I needed the therapy of immersing myself in ocean water, it might be okay to just go in and take a dip as if I was somebody who's cooling off. But if I start lingering in the water to get that therapeutic effect of the salt water on my skin, that's not really something that is life-threatening or even so painful that I won't be able to enjoy Shabbos unless I go in and get that therapy. So that sort of therapy would be prohibited. All right, now we're continuing that discussion. And we've been talking here in Mishnah number 3 about foods that have therapeutic effect, but they're food, right? It's not a medicine. So something that only gets eaten as a medicine, okay, well, that's a medicine. And if it's not a life-threatening situation, if it's just to alleviate an ailment, so we don't do that. We wouldn't eat that particular type of substance. But there are certain foods that do provide therapeutic effect, and they're eaten simply as food. That is permitted. So anything that is commonly eaten as food, even though it may help you on Shabbos with whatever your ailment is, it is permitted to eat that food. Apropos of that discussion, we got into a whole bunch of treatments, very specific treatments. And so now we're in the midst of a pretty long digression, not so much about what is permitted or what's prohibited on Shabbos, but treatments for various conditions that come up. Yesterday, we were talking a little bit about a tapeworm, which the Gomorrah is referring to as a snake, but Rav Steinsaltz says in that situation, it really means a tapeworm or some kind of, internal worm. But having introduced it by the name of a snake, now we start talking about actual snakes. And now we're going to get some treatments which seem a little bit like a medical process in the old world, right? In the old world where it wasn't just, a remedy wasn't just a pill or an ointment or some kind of a preparation that you swallow. There was also procedures, right? Procedures that involved all kinds of activities of getting up and sitting down and having amulets made and bringing the particular plant or bark or animal or this or that. And it's like whole elaborate procedures that one has to go through to get rid of the condition. And now that we're talking about these elaborate type of procedures to get rid of an ailment, now we're talking about, well, it's not even for an ailment. Now it starts to sound a little bit more like some kind of an exorcism, right? And that is something that we'll talk about in our journey through the Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud, which was not completed, but it was, the Mishnah is the Mishnah, so the Mishnah was prepared in the Holy Land, and the editors finished that job under the supervision of Yehuda Hanasi about the year 200. And then over the next 300 or 400 years, there was kind of a parallel process of sages in Israel and sages in Babylonia discussing all of the teachings in the Mishnah and creating the Gomorrah. And that's why we have two separate Talmuds. There's a huge amount of overlap, of course, but there's a lot of differences. The main difference, however, is that the Babylonian Talmud, which was created by the Jewish community in Babylonia, was finished. So when we just say the Talmud, we generally mean the Babylonian Talmud or Talmud Bavli in Hebrew. When we talk about the Jerusalem Talmud or the Talmud Yerushalmi, sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud, so there we're talking about the Gomorrah that was being prepared in the Holy Land. But there, the persecution of the Jews under the Roman authority was much more intense than the liberty that was afforded the Jews in Babylonia. And so, unfortunately, the scholars who were working in the Holy Land, in Eretz Yisrael, but under Roman authority, there was so much persecution of the Jews there and of the Torah leadership that in the end they weren't able to complete the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi. A difference, though, another difference between them is that in the Yerushalmi, there's actually very little mention of demons, of demons and demonic forces. But in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, there's a lot of discussion of demons and demonology. And so one of the theories about why that is because the Jewish community working in Babylonia was ensconced in a greater culture, just like American Jews are living in America and Israeli Jews are in an Israeli culture. The Babylonian Jews were surrounded by this Babylonian culture. Now, the Babylonian culture was no longer Babylonia per se. That's the region they were in, but this was now part of the Persian Empire. The Persians had defeated the Babylonians hundreds of years earlier and still had authority in that part of the world. And the normative religion, the most popular religion in that part of the world was Zoroastrianism. And in the Zoroastrian religion, demons and snakes figure quite prominently. And so since that was already going on in the culture and people had a lot of questions and concerns about those things, that may be why the sages who were operating in that community had much more to say on that subject. So here we're talking about what do you do if you're pursued by an angry snake. So when we're talking here in the Talmud about an angry snake, I mean, it may be that it's just simply, an aggressive snake who, is coming after you. Here in Southern California, especially for those of us who play golf and don't play very well, and our balls are often errant and out into the desert, it's always a concern that you might run into a rattlesnake. That's a real thing. But rattlesnakes, which are incredibly dangerous and incredibly poisonous, they don't pursue us. The only time you have an encounter with a rattlesnake is when you surprise it, and it wants to defend itself, and that's why it bites. But snakes don't come after people. They're shy of people. Here, the sages are talking about a snake that will actually pursue a person. And so that was understood to be not just a snake, functioning in the natural way. This was some kind of a dark spiritual force in the guise of a snake coming after a person. And so the sages are now going to offer a procedure for how to handle that situation. So let me get that here. Right, so one at whom a snake is angry and is being pursued by a snake, if he has another with him, let him ride 4 cubits. That's kind of hilarious. I mean, I'm not sure if he means, if you have an animal with you, like a horse or a donkey, that you ride the horse or the donkey. But if it's saying that, well, the snake seems to be angry at me, so I'm going to hop on your back and you're just going to, carry me. Not a long distance, just 4 cubits. But being off the ground and traveling, just 6 feet in one direction, maybe that will help me. When I read that, it made me think of the old joke about 2 guys are hiking and they come around a corner on the trail and there's a bear, a grizzly bear, that very dangerous encounter during a hike. And the bear is growling at them. These guys are frozen, scared to death. One of them starts taking off his backpack. And the other one whispers, "Hey, what are you doing? You can't outrun a bear." And the other guy says, "I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you." So, here the instruction is that you should hop on your friend's back and have him carry you for a few feet, for 4 cubits. But if that doesn't work, let him jump over a ditch. Perhaps that will discourage the snake from chasing you over the ditch. And if not, let the person cross a river. And at night, let him place his bed on 4 barrels and sleep outside beneath the stars. And let one bring 4 cats and let one tie them to the 4 legs of the bed. And let one bring twigs and branches and throw them there, so that when the cats hear the sound of the snake crawling over the twigs and branches, the cat will eat the snake. One who is being pursued by a snake, let him run in sand, because a snake cannot move as quickly in sand as a person can. So, make of it what you will. I mean, one thing that's interesting about this kind of procedure, and we're going to do another one momentarily about curing jaundice. I mean, these procedures get elaborate. As I mentioned yesterday, I think one thing that's interesting about them, especially when we're talking about curing physical maladies as opposed to, this pursuing an angry snake, that the fact that, try this, and if that doesn't work, try that. If that doesn't work, try that. So first of all, it is a scientific process that they're engaged in. They have very limited, scientific resources and technology, but they went through a trial and error process to find that works. And they recognize that not every treatment is going to work for every person. So each person has to go through a trial and error process until he comes on the cure that works. And what's nice about transmitting this kind of wisdom is, when a person is faced with this kind of problem, it's terrible if the situation feels so desperate that there is no solution. Here the sages are offering you a list of things that you can try. That's going to be encouraging to a person, that there's a lot of things they can try. There's no reason to give up. And some of them, as they get more and more elaborate, are going to be very difficult to finally pull together. And so, maybe one of the best aspects of this kind of list of potential procedures is that time is passing as you're trying one cure after another. And hopefully the problem will sort itself out, which is a little bit behind the theory of take 2 aspirin, call me in the morning. It's not so much that the aspirin solves the problem as the passage of time. I think a lot of doctors would agree. Okay, so that's in terms of the pursuing snakes. I would also add that, now this is just my personal view, but when we think that the sages were operating, in this Zoroastrian community, and there was more talk, about demons and pursuing snakes and stuff like that. But if we go further back and a little deeper into the tradition, we see that the ancient world had, how can I put it, had much more of a sense, an attachment, a belief, a working knowledge of the sublime, of the mystical, of the supernatural. It was just much more a part of that world, as we find in all of our literature from that time. So I think there's a temptation in modern people to say, well, we understand the world much better. We're so much more educated. Our technology is so much sharper. And it's because these people were primitive that they allowed themselves to believe in all these, hocus pocus make-believe forces. And I would submit that that's a very arrogant view. And it's one that may be entirely wrong. It may be wrong. Because one thing that we see when we read the Talmud, right? And this is literature that was compiled 1,500 years ago in terms of the Gomorrah, 2,000 years ago in terms of the Mishnah, and much further back when we talk about Scripture. And in all of this literature, especially when you talk about the Torah, the Bible, the first 5 books of the Bible, you don't read that text and think to yourself, wow, these people were real simpletons. They were very sophisticated people with very sophisticated use of language, developing a very sophisticated legal system with truly an incredible understanding of astronomy and the motion of the stars, which they gathered without telescopes, but just from the naked eye. They were deep thinkers, right? They weren't simpletons who just fell prey to any superstition. So it may well be that the ancient world was more fluid than our world. Now, this is just Sal suggesting here. This is just me sharing my thoughts for a moment. And I'll keep it quick. I won't spend too much time on my personal theory. But I do believe that God created the world. That is not to say that carbon dating and evolution and dinosaurs are all a myth. They're not. I think that God created a 16 billion year old world. Not one that just had fossils in it, but a world that had its entire span. All these things happened in God's world. God is outside of time, so he can easily fashion a world in which all these things happen, and he may have fashioned that world, who knows how long ago. Maybe it was only 5, 6, 7,000 years ago. A world that contains in it billions of years of history, of things that actually happened in this world, which is created by God then. What I'm getting at is that when the world was younger in terms of when God created it, and people were functioning in it, it may well be that reality was a little bit more fluid. And miracles and, effective prayer and prophecy and all these aspects of the ancient world, which we as moderns, might be quick to dismiss. It may well be that all of that was happening in a big way. And the world only became sort of harder and more accepted as a real and unmystical place over time, because so many skeptical people just kind of came along and accepted the world as it is, and it's like the world became firmer and more crystalline, as it were, less fluid, less subject to sort of spiritual forces and varying belief systems and the power of prophecy, prayer, etc. It may well be. I don't have proof of this. No one really could prove this. I'm just saying it's possible that the world's firmness was a little more fluid back then. And if so, then we can understand, these kinds of teachings and these elaborate procedures, for dealing with demons and angels and prophecy, pursuing snakes that are angry, etc. And God speaking to us, through all these different channels, as something that is not, just folklore, okay, but as something that was happening and that's been captured for us in this literature. Something to think about. Okay. All right, now we're getting back to actual consuming foods and beverages, and the basic principle is that all food and drink that is consumed as food and drink, even if not commonly consumed, even if it has medicinal properties, and even if it can be harmful, food that is eaten but that can be harmful if you consume too much of it or if the wrong person eats it, sort of strong foods that used properly have one effect, used improperly have another effect. These are the kind of foods that, for certain people with certain conditions can have a stronger medicinal value. Those are going to be allowed on Shabbos as long as they function as food, all right? As long as it's food also, then you can use it as medicine. And so the example that's given here, Ula brings down, the sage Ula, who used to do quite a bit of traveling between the Jewish community in Israel and in Babylonia. He was one of those sages that traveled back and forth between the communities and was very important because he was sort of cross-pollinating the teachings of the two communities with each other. And Ula mentions that, when somebody is, blocked intestinally, right? So somebody is having a problem. He's constipated, right? He's having a problem going to the bathroom. So they give a few different, potential remedies for that involving palm water and some other things. And Ula said, for me, all I need is Babylonian beer. So apparently Babylonian beer, which was not made from hops or barley or wheat, but rather from dates. Babylonian beer was made from dates, and it was a strong brew. And for somebody who's not accustomed to Babylonian beer, a beginner in Babylonian beer, if you will, it would really accelerate things going through the system, and it would give a person who's not used to it the runs. So that's definitely harmful for somebody who's not accustomed to Babylonian beer and doesn't know he's going to suffer that effect. But for somebody who's constipated, drinking a bit of Babylonian beer can have a real, therapeutic effect. Can he take that essentially medication on Shabbos? Yes, because Babylonian beer is beer. It's not primarily a medicine. It's primarily a drink. It's just not for everybody. As the title of today's class says, Babylonian beer is not for beginners. Rav Yosef taught that Egyptian zitom is a kind of a cure-all when we're talking about either getting blocked or having the runs. And he says that you make this mixture that's 1/3 barley, 1/3 saffron, 1/3 salt. Who knows what if it's literally just those three things, kind of like as a powder, or do you mix it with water? I mean, we don't know exactly how it was prepared. But that this mixture called Egyptian zitom, if you're blocked, it will unblock you. And if you have the runs, it will slow you down. So it works either way. And Rav Yosef recommends that it's especially useful between Passover and Shavuot. So that's interesting because what's happening between Passover and Shavuot? We're counting the Omer. That is a time of spiritual refinement. But there's also a harvest theme going from that time, that on the second day of Passover, that's the time that the barley harvest comes in. And then we count 50 days until Shavuot, and that's when the wheat harvest comes in. So one of the spiritual teachings of counting the Omer, counting the days between Passover and Shavuos, right, between celebrating the Exodus from Egypt and the revelation at Sinai, is that we're elevating our soul, we're refining our soul, and essentially at Passover time, it's like we're barley eaters, because the barley is harvested earlier in the season, but barley is essentially animal food. And 50 days later, we've refined ourselves so that we can eat wheat, right, which is human food. And so we refine ourselves to move from animal food to human food, from animal food to human food. Okay, and now we come to, and so the fact that this zitom is based on barley perhaps is why he's recommending it in that period between Passover and Shavuos. Okay, now we come to a cure for jaundice. And the cure for jaundice is quite elaborate. Let me just get this in front of me. Hold on a second. Just want to make sure I'm starting in the right place. Yeah. Okay. So the Gomorrah states, for jaundice, one should drink 2 of the 3 ingredients mentioned together with beer, and one becomes sterile from it. We're going to come back to that. The Gomorrah continues to discuss this remedy. And if one does not have these ingredients, so it started higher up. Right, so it was talking about a different cure for a different condition that strikes women, but that this can also be used as the basis of a cure for jaundice. But for jaundice, you take two of those 3 ingredients mentioned together. Now you mix it with beer. Now it's going to be a cure for jaundice, but it's going to cause sterility. We're going to come back to that. The Gomorrah continues to discuss this remedy. And if one does not have these ingredients, i.e. Alexandrian gum, saffron, and alum, or if the remedy did not work, let one bring the head of a salted shibuta fish and boil it in beer and drink it. And if this is not effective, let one bring grasshopper brine and drink it. And if one does not have grasshopper brine, let one bring brine of small birds and enter the bathhouse and smear himself with it. So, right, in the same series of cures, now we're going from ingesting to solving as an ointment. And if there is no bathhouse, have him stand between the oven and the wall and sweat out his disease. Rabbi Yochanan said, one who seeks to warm this patient should wrap him tightly in his sheet. And Rav Acha Bar Yosef was sick with this disease, and Rav Kahana performed this remedy for him, and he was healed. Now, having discussed, well, and it even goes on, and if the remedy is not effective, let one bring 3 vessels of Persian dates and 3 vessels of dripping wax and 3 vessels of red aloe and boil them in beer and drink it. See, it always gets more and more elaborate. And if this remedy is not effective, let one bring a donkey foal and shave the middle of its head and let blood from the donkey's forehead and place it on his own head. And he should take care not to let the blood enter his eyes, lest it blind him. And if this is not effective, let one bring a pickled ram's head and boil it in beer and drink it. And if this is not effective, let him bring a striped something else, i.e. a pig, and tear it open and place it on his heart. And if this is not effective, let him bring leeks from the middle of the row, which are very sharp. Okay, so having given this whole list of procedures that one can try, to cure jaundice, right? So what we're curing is jaundice. I think jaundice is also known as lockjaw. It often results in having yellow skin, and if left untreated, it can become a very, very serious and painful disease. Now, the Gemara discussed the remedy for jaundice, saying that one should drink 2 of the 3 ingredients mentioned above together with beer and one becomes sterile from it. The Gomorrah asks, and is it permitted to cause sterility? No, it is not permitted to cause sterility. The halakha is that it is prohibited to castrate a man. So the first objection to that is, well, wait a minute, we don't seek to castrate, we're seeking to cure jaundice. If, as a side effect, he becomes sterile, it's not that we have violated the prohibition on sterilizing a man, or the prohibition on castrating a man. It's just a side effect that he won't be able to procreate. And so the and the evidence for that, the source for that, Rabbi Yochanan says, is that it's permitted to remove the comb of a rooster. And if you do, the rooster will stop procreating. In other words, it's akin to castrating the rooster, and we permit that even though, according to, what is the verse? Because the verse states, those regarding offerings and one who can bring offerings, right? So regarding offerings and who can bring offerings. Those whose testicles are bruised or crushed or torn or cut shall not be offered to the Lord, and you shall not do this in your land. So this is talking about if you're bringing a sheep offering, a lamb or a ram or a ewe, or you're bringing a goat or you're bringing a bull. So it can't have the blemish that its testicles are crushed or otherwise maimed. And it also says, and you shall not do this throughout your land. It seems that the Torah is saying that we don't even castrate animals, let alone a person. We don't do that. It's prohibited to castrate a man. But here we see that you can remove the rooster's comb. That's not prohibited. It has nothing to do with the testicles, but it will stop the rooster from procreating. So Rav Ashi answers that, and he says, yeah, but that doesn't sterilize the rooster. The rooster can certainly still procreate. It's just that when you remove the comb from the rooster, it's like he loses his mojo. It actually says that the rooster loses his arrogance. He's less proud, and so he won't approach the hens, and that's why the rooster stops procreating. So rather, that doesn't prove that one can castrate animals. So rather, we would only give this medicine that produces sterility to a man who's already castrated, because if he's not already castrated, we just can't give him this particular treatment for jaundice because we're afraid that it will sterilize him. Rabbi Chia bar Abba is going to answer, well, actually, we penalize one who adds leavening to a meal offering, even if leavening has already been added to it. He's using this as an analogy. So when we bring offerings, when the temple is standing and we bring the various kinds of offerings, sin offerings, guilt offerings, peace offerings, elevation offerings, etc., along with the animal, which might be, like I said, a sheep, a goat, or a bull, might also be a bird. There are bird offerings. And for the poor who can't afford even those things, and along with some of the animal offerings, there's a meal offering. So a meal offering it's almost like a tortilla that's being brought. It's a flour offering mixed with water and a bit of oil and made into an unleavened cake, right? So it's like soft matzah, or you can think of it as like a wheat tortilla that were brought on the altar, and that's part of the meal offering. It is prohibited to add leavening, yeast, to the meal offering. What Rabbi Chia bar Abba is saying here is that if you add leavening to a meal offering, you violated a Torah prohibition. You're actually going to need to bring a sin offering for that if you did it unwittingly. And this applies even if somebody else already added leavening to the meal offering before you, right? Unlike the case of trapping a deer in a house, which we saw a few days ago, that if the first person comes and sits in the doorway and traps the deer inside a house, a deer wandered into a house on Shabbos, if you close the door on that house, So then you've trapped the deer inside and you violated the Torah prohibition of trapping on Shabbos. If you don't close the door, but you sit in the doorway in such a way that you fill the doorway, then you also are guilty of trapping the deer. If a person comes and sits next to you, right, and you're the one who trapped the deer, but then you get up and walk away, he's still there. His presence there where he is now constituting the trap. But we learned that he's exempt. He didn't trap the deer. The first person trapped the deer. Unlike that case, if one person adds leavening to a meal offering, he's guilty. And if another person comes along and adds leavening to a meal offering that's going on, that's been consecrated to be offered up on the temple, on the altar, he also is guilty. And so why does Rabbi Chia bar Abba mention this? By analogy to say that even if a man has been castrated, if you give him a medicine that's going to render him sterile, that's a different thing that you're doing to him. Castrating is like cutting a connection. Sterilizing is like an inner thing. And it's sort of both produce the effect that the man won't be able to procreate, but they affect the body differently, and so it's prohibited. You can't give this treatment that might sterilize a man, even to a man who's already been castrated. So rather, according to Rabbi Chia bar Abba, this cure is only for an old man who's already past the time of procreating. But Rabbi Yochanan objects to that. And he says, well, actually, I thought I was past the age of procreating. I became an old man. But, they gave me certain kinds of treatments to reinvigorate me. And I regained my youthful vigor, and I was able to father children even in my old age. And in fact, that's a teaching of the rabbis that if a person has an opportunity to father children even in his old age, he should do it. He should create children because it's always good to create children. For the rabbis, it's a big positive value. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment, to create children. So Rabbi Yochanan says, so even an old man might have more children, so don't give him some kind of a medicine for jaundice that might sterilize him. Rather, this treatment is only for a woman. Why a woman? Because men are commanded to be fruitful and multiply. Women are not. Women obviously participate in the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply, and they are rewarded tremendously for it in heaven. But the actual obligation to have children sits on a man. A man is obligated. And there are different theories for this. We're not going to go into this. This is a long topic. We could certainly spend a whole hour talking about the obligation, the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. There are many opinions on this subject. Right now, we'll just mention in passing and super briefly that the way the debate finally shook out over time is that men are obligated to have children. Jewish men are obligated to have children. And per the opinion of Hillel, in his debate with Shammai, a man is obligated to keep having children until he's produced one boy and one girl. Now, that's not to say that if he doesn't have those children that he somehow sinned. It's just that he's obligated to keep trying. Not everyone's going to have children. Not everybody's going to be blessed with children. It doesn't work out for everybody. But according to the Talmud, a man is obligated to keep trying to have children until he has a boy and a girl. And there are many, many, many qualifiers to that. That's just a general principle, and there's a lot of exceptions to it. Women are not obligated, but they are amply rewarded for participating in that. Non-Jews are not obligated to have children, but like women are strongly encouraged to have children and are rewarded in heaven for having children. And it's a general principle by rabbinic decree. As it says in the book of Isaiah, the world was not created to be uninhabited. And we all do God's business when we engage in reproducing, right? Making sure that there's going to be another generation to replace us is sort of everybody's business, and encouraging the health and the education and the continuity of the species. That's good for everybody because the world was made to be inhabited. So therefore, since women are, they may not be obligated, but they're rewarded for it and strongly encouraged to participate in making kids. And one of the reasons given why men are obligated and women are simply rewarded is because, women just naturally are going to be more, tuned into the human value of having, another generation to replace us. They don't need to be obligated. Men need to be obligated, to sort of focus them from their wild and selfish ways to get more into the family line. And so therefore, this treatment for jaundice, which has this side effect of sterilizing a person, for whom can we use that treatment? Who is not going to be, who can that treatment be used on? Somebody who's just not going to have kids. Like, it's just not possible, physically not possible. And so the example given here is an elderly woman. An elderly woman just doesn't have the possibility to bear children anymore when she's way past her childbearing years. And it almost seems like, wow, are we really going to discriminate against elderly women and sort of separate them from the whole rest of the population? But, once again, we see that distinctions have positive and negative effects because she's the only one that qualifies to get what is perhaps the most effective remedy for jaundice. She can get healed with it. Everyone else, it's a problem. So that's where we are at the end of this daf. Page Kuf Yud, page 110 in Tractate Shabbos. Let me see if we've got some comments or questions. Arnold Alban says, it's so good to be together. Thank you for being here, Arnold. Christo Cheney says, I've read very little of the Jerusalem Talmud in English. Almost no English translations of it are available. There is an Artscroll Talmud Yerushalmi. It has been created, and it's awesome. In the same way that the Artscroll treated the Babylonian Talmud, it exists for the Jerusalem Talmud. But like I said, it is incomplete. And there are people who, embark to read the whole Yerushalmi in the same way that we do Daf Yomi to read the Babylonian Talmud. But the Babylonian Talmud is more complete. And when people do Daf Yomi, they're talking about the Bavli. Now, some people, I know the Rabbi Blau here in Hancock Park, he's doing this, that this cycle, he's doing Daf Yomi, he's going to do every page of the Bavli, but he's also adding at the beginning of his classes to do, a few Mishnahs from the books of the Mishnah that are not included in the Bavli, right? So for example, if you buy the Artscroll Talmud, or for that matter, the Koran Talmud, it doesn't have a Gomorrah. A Gomorrah doesn't exist for every book of the Mishnah, right? The Jerusalem Talmud comments on some books of the Mishnah that aren't included in the Babylonian. And, for example, the most famous book of all, Pirkei Avos, which is like the greatest hits of Jewish wisdom from the Mishnaic period and earlier, it's not in the Babylonian Talmud. There is no Gomorrah on Pirkei Avos. So if you want to make sure that you also read Pirkei Avos, you have to add it to your library and to your reading program. And so Rabbi Blau is adding a few Mishnahs at the beginning of each class from the books of the Mishnah that are not included in the Babylonian Talmud so that he can really complete the entire Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud. Elizabeth Hunt Lucarini says, reminds me of Exit Pursued by a Bear. I assume referring to the bear joke that I told earlier. Tom Beck says, can you mount your bed on barrels and tie cats to the legs on Shabbos? Presumably no. There we were just talking about a cure that you're dealing with the snake that's pursuing you. Well, so now it's an interesting question. Right? Is the snake that's pursuing you endangering your life? So if you feel that you need to get your bed up on a barrel to save your life, so yeah. But if you're doing it because, you're irritated by the snake that's pursuing you, so then, I don't think you can move your bed out into the public domain. Maybe because there's an eruv, so it's not going to be carrying from private to public. But when you're carrying furniture around on Shabbos and taking it outside and then creating this structure of the barrels, I mean, that's just starting to seem like it's not going to work unless it's to save a life that's in danger. Carolyn Dobson Chavez. Is the Torah literal? Does the Talmud support its literal interpretation? Also, what to do if one has dreamed of being chased by a snake that is trying to bite the ankle area? Well, in terms of interpretation of dreams, I refer you to Brachos 55, 56, 57. And we talked a lot about dream interpretation, and you can find those classes in the AT Daily section of accidentaltalmudist.org. Is the Torah literal? Yes, except where it's not being literal. There are passages here and there where even the sages will say the Torah was speaking in the language of men, or the language of people. And sometimes in the language of people, we use certain phrases, to have a meaning that is a little bit different than the literal meaning. But generally speaking, we believe that every verse in the Torah functions on at least 4 levels, really infinite levels. But we say it's pardes. So the first level is peshat, meaning the literal meaning. And the literal meaning has to work because, every verse is true. Then there's the remez, the scent, right? Each verse has a scent of something deeper that ties it to other verses in the Torah, other verses in Scripture, other verses in the oral tradition. Then the derosh, something much deeper. Right now, where we're pulling out ethical teachings and mystical teachings, and well, not so much mysticism, but especially the ethical and deeper and more profound teachings. And then at the deepest level, the sod, the inner, hidden Torah, the mystical meanings that are just not available to everybody and to the uninitiated. It's really only going to be for the people that dedicate their whole lives to learn at that level, that they can get into the real mystical depths of the verses. Now, I know that, for a lot of modern ears, this is problematic. They're like, well, there's stuff in the Bible that just is so contrary to the archaeological record. And there I would say to you what Maimonides would say. If there's a conflict, a contradiction between Scripture and science, we are not understanding one or the other or both correctly. There is no contradiction between Scripture and science. Apparent contradictions simply need deeper study to understand what is between them. So I guess that's the best answer that I can give on this question. That's what I've got for us today. I look forward to being with you tomorrow. God willing, we'll move on to page 111 and we'll start a new Mishnah, one who is concerned about pain in his teeth. So we're going to be talking a little bit about a toothache tomorrow. All the best.